united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
And looking ahead.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?
Okay, so good morning everyone, and welcome. If you're tuning it only now or joining us in the room, you're still perfectly on time. Welcome to Politico's Sustainable Future Week Summit. My name is Federica Di Stadio, and I'm a climate reporter here at Politico. And I'm delighted to introduce you our distinguished panelists. So we have here with us Edvard Pernod. He's the Secretary General at the Zero Emissions Platform. Welcome, Edvard. We're also joined by Anders Egerud. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Stockholm Exergi. Welcome. Then we have Christian Olsleitner. He's the head of unit for low carbon solutions, land economy and carbon removals at DG Klima at the Commission. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And finally, we also are joined by Anastasio Perimenis. He's the Secretary General at CO2 Value Europe.
Good morning.
So we have a great panel here, but before, let me say a few words on why it is important that we are here today to discuss the future of carbon removals for Europe's climate neutrality. So we listened before to my colleague, Zia Weiser. She was talking about in the previous panels, an interview about the future of the Green Deal. She even questioned whether there is still a Green Deal, but of course there is no Green Deal without negative emissions, because this is so strictly linked to the project of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And so the importance, the significance of carbon removals is something that nobody is questioning anymore. I would say there is broad consensus both in political but also obviously scientific circles. The EU especially has started to set a clear vision as well for 2040 and for 2050, giving some clear targets. Even though they're not targets yet, they're just an estimates, which spoke about some pretty impressive figures. We spoke about reaching 280 million tons of carbon capture by 2040, and then ramping up to 450 million tons of carbon by 2050, just 10 years later. So we have sketched a broad vision of what we intend to do, but there are obviously a lot of questions that remain, and it's exactly about those questions. For instance, how do we make sure that we create this giant amount of carbon removal capacity that will be needed to match the amount of emissions that we will keep pumping into the atmosphere, or how do we create the right incentives? And on a more technical level, should we integrate the removals into the European cap and trade system? So those are, just to give you a sense, many of the questions that we need to answer, and I'm very happy to try to find some answers with you all today. So let me start. I would like to set the scene initially and speak to you, Christian, just to start. one of the things that I mentioned and that is really top of mind for most of the people here working in Brussels on carbon removals is the role that they're going to play in the 2040 climate targets. We are eagerly awaiting this piece of legislation. We want to see the role the carbon removals will play there. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I mean, you've already sketched it out a bit, but let me first say, there's no question we have to reduce our emissions first, and we have to do it fast. And we are on a good way. With the rollout of renewable energy, we are on our path there. But we will always have a certain amount of emissions in our system, just from the very basic fact that we need food. We always have emissions from livestock, from the use of fertilizers. We will have emissions in some industrial processes and probably also from mobility like intercontinental flights. So we need to get better at actively taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And after 2050, we need to go negative. So whatever we do with the emissions, we need removals. It's not enough that we stay at this zero. Always having this talk about you have to offset the remaining emissions. This is going much further. This is just like a first milestone. So we need to develop removals. And by this, what I'm so excited about is we need to design value chains that will be good for the climate and not bad for the climate. So if you look at the bioeconomy, we capture first the carbon in the forests, in the soils. And then it's about, okay, what do we produce out of that biomass? And we need to use then this biogenic carbon much more sustainably. Like, for example, in long-lasting buildings, with biomaterials, with the right combination, with low-carbon cement, we can store carbon there for another 100, maybe 200 years. And of course, at a certain point, we need to incinerate. But then the CO2 shouldn't go back to the atmosphere, but it needs to be captured. And then it can be like a feedstock for the chemical industry. Well-managed, long-lasting plastic packaging is also a great way how to keep the CO2 in. And then at the end, maybe we incinerate again, a certain amount of that CO2 we need to put back from where we've taken the fossil carbon initially, like in the empty gas fields and oil fields of the North Sea. So it's about looking at this value chain. Now, I've described one with biogenic carbon. You can also talk in the same way about CO2 captured from the air. And so removals should become, when we look into the future, a key performance indicator for our industry, how sustainable it is. How well do we manage to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and keep it here with us, and don't let it go back to the atmosphere. And that's the challenge that we'll need to have. And I always want to emphasize that as it's a value chain. So we need to talk as much about what you sometimes call nature-based, land-based removals, as well as then the industrial ones. And that's one value chain that we need to look at.
Yeah, thank you. I see the point. Let me just have a very quick follow-up with you as well, and then we will also want to see what other panelists think about it. But it's very clear you started by emphasizing the role of mitigation deterrence and the fact that we shouldn't look at carbon removals as creating mitigation deterrence. But let me mention this straight away. There is one issue that we are all looking at, which is the whether we should have separate targets or not for carbon removals, and in particular for land-based and permanent carbon removals. So what does the Commission think to do in this moment in time? Because we are hearing some rumors that the Commission might not be so interested to have separate targets at this moment.
So as I said, we need to develop all of them, and we need to clearly distinguish between them. So you have industrial removals like bioenergy with CCS, and that you can store permanently with with geological storage. You can do a lot in farming, in forestry, and you need to you need to give an incentive that farmers really stay and foresters stay in there and do it. But then you also have all the co-benefits for biodiversity on that you need to have a look at. And on the resilience, we need very resilient forests and lands. So we need to incentivize all of that. Mm-hmm. And as you also said before, in our 2040 communication on where we explain the 90%, we are very clear about the range for 2040, which is around 400 million tons of removals, and that's both the ones we get from the LULUCF sink, to use that word, so the land-based ones, as well as then the industrial ones, bioenergy, CCS, biochar, and probably also already direct air capture by 2040.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Edvard, you have been looking very closely at the legislation, everything concerning carbon removals, and in particular carbon capture and storage. I was wondering, what are your expectations for the way carbon removals should be treated in the 2040 communication? And I've mentioned before in the introduction these ambitious targets that the EU has set for itself. Mm-hmm. How likely are we to achieve these targets right now if you look at the current capacity of carbon removals in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very. Whoa, that's very loud. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me this morning. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the Commission for the work that you did in the last cycle. I mean, when we started in the beginning of the mandate in 2019, nobody was talking about carbon capture and storage seriously and carbon removals. And look where we are now, where we have not only political targets, and I'll get into them in a sec, but also legal targets we've set in law in the Net Zero Industry Act, which sets a 50 million ton operational storage capacity by 2030. To give a bit of context in that, right now, there are no operational storage sites in the EU. We have one under construction in Portos, not too far away in the Netherlands. And Christian, alluded to that, we need to accelerate the development of storage, and industries will be able to store it in the North Sea, for example. But what really is important is that actually, if we want to reduce the overall cost of this system, we cannot just store all of our CO2 in the North Sea. And we have actually pretty good geology. We have the right rocks in most parts of Europe, right? Some places aren't so good, like in Finland and Estonia. They will probably have to transport them elsewhere. But we have the right geology, and it's also a lot cheaper to do it onshore, about 10 times cheaper than it costs to do offshore. So it starts with firstly accepting that, yes, removals, reductions, they're separate. We've got very, good rules to kind of keep them separate in terms of our accounting. But there are actually synergies that are here as well. When we're scaling up storage capacity, we have the potential to reduce emissions, but then also to remove them as well, sometimes even from the same site. So if I'm a cement producer, I've got my process emissions, but I might also have biogenic feedstock. And so if I'm going to do a capture project, I'm going to capture both types of emissions. And so in that case, I could also do removals in the same project and then store them permanently in the geosphere, and that's ultimately where it needs to go. That's the first key point here. We need to look at where we can do the storage to reduce the overall cost. The second big thing is the rules that we have here. So at the moment, there is no real clear framework for when we're capturing my CO2 and then I'm transporting it and then I'm storing it somewhere else. It's very often we want to de-risk this. We want to have 3 different people or 3 different companies that are going to do that. Pipeline companies know what they're doing, shipping companies know what they're doing, storage companies know what they're doing, but they're not experts in the other parts of the chain. So that works well, just so long as everyone is clear on what the rules are. And that's, the Commission is kind of committed to doing this in the next cycle, and that's something that we'll be keen to help them with. The third thing, and I think that this is something that really needs to be emphasized, when we're talking about, the incentives, let's say, to do carbon capture, to do removals, particularly, in the industrial sector, so often the only real incentive to do that is the emissions trading system. But now we're starting, projects such as Breivik in Heidelberg Materials is first of a kind cement CCS project in Norway is just finished construction there this week. They will have a different product. It's still cement. It still works great, and it's structurally integrity in terms of what it does. but it's different because they will actually have substantially reduced the carbon footprint from this. We see this the same in the fertilizer sector, we see this the same in other industrial sectors as well. The problem is we don't actually have a clear market to develop these. You're basically depending on someone else is going to buy this at a higher premium. And so this is something that I think that really should be on the table in the clean industrial deal, is looking at these sort of lead markets for low carbon products and services. You know, we'll talk about waste to energy in a sec, you know, and sort of and biogenic CO2 being captured at CHP plants. Those types of services and products that are being produced are different, and we're going to need to try and price them differently, especially in the beginning. And that's something that Europe can actually lead on in terms of the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And what you said leads me to ask a question maybe to Anders, who's the person really representing the business. And so you're at the helm of a Swedish district and cooling provider, and you also obviously provide with carbon removals. And I was wondering, what has been the biggest challenge to offer something while there is no clear legislation yet that maybe justifies the demand for it?
Yeah, that's a good and relevant question, but let me start from a little bit other perspective. When we started our journey to become as fossil-free as possible, we could actually see that we can do reduction in our businesses tremendously, and we are based on 98% renewable and recovered energy. But then we can clearly see that we have the possibility in the district heating and cooling sector existing already, utilizing waste wood, utilizing residues from the forestry, which we are doing to produce electricity, which are needed for the society, and heating, which is also needed for the society. But then we can add carbon capture into that. And by adding that, we can also utilize the process heat from the process of capturing the carbon. And that makes the process extremely sustainable and efficient. And then, of course, we need to continue that value chain of actually liquefying the carbon dioxide as well. That also produces a lot of energy, which we can take care in the district heating system again. And then finally, we need to transport it and permanently store it. So we are creating net negative emissions. And that means that our company, we will actually take away more emissions than we will produce. And that's a very, very few sectors in the world which are capable of doing that. The cement industry will not be capable of that. The steel industry will not be capable of doing that. They also need to purchase, actually, net negative emissions from other companies which can produce them. Mm-hmm. And that's the really track which our Christian here is mentioned about. We need to go beyond zero. Otherwise, we will not ever reach net zero. So then the challenges. There are no markets, but there are a voluntary carbon market. And there are companies in the world which are really foresighted and are forerunners, like Microsoft, for instance. They clearly see that in their ambitions to reach net zero, they need to purchase carbon removal certificates. And we have a contract, of course, with Microsoft. We have a contract with many of the tech industries globally, unfortunately not that many in Europe. And they clearly see that their roadmap towards net zero, they need to purchase carbon removal certificates from net negative emissions which are produced in a sustainable way. So that was one of the challenges. The other challenge is, of course, that it's not enough to just have the voluntary carbon market financing this today. You need to have more pillars. We have been, and I think the EU has done tremendously a lot of work regarding carbon removal. So the first thing that we received, the innovation fund for our project, was extremely helpful to start us deploy this project. And then now we need also actually to have the national scheme for subsidies in place in Sweden, where we are bidding into the reversed auction at the time being. Hopefully we will have that successfully in our bidding, and then we can go towards an FID. So what we are trying to do is to build up the voluntary carbon market, and I can come back to that a little bit, but we need, in the startup of this industry, we need also to have support. And that has come from the EU Innovation Fund, and it's also from a national scheme. And those national schemes are different in all countries, I would say also. So that is also something which could be addressed for the future, how to regulate this in a more efficient way. But I think for time being, and if I then should look at the challenges, where are the challenges? That we need to have a clear target for removals, not only for for reductions is the most important. But going to 2040, we definitely need to have that included. And that the carbon removal certificate framework need to address this thing, which it has done. I think it's a tremendous step forward. And now we are talking about also going forward, the green claim need to actually look at the world, see that there is a need for businesses, there is a need for voluntary carbon market, there are a need for also subsidies to build up this industry. But then it's definitely possible. And if I look at our project, we will capture close to 1 million tons. That's quite a significant amount. It's as much as the traffic emits in Stockholm during 1 year. But talking about the tremendous challenge we have ahead of us, it's 250 months left to 2050. We should build more or less 1 each month. And that is, you understand, that's impossible. So this is a part of the puzzle. And locally, bio-CCS with carbon capture can be extremely efficient, like we have our project in Stockholm, in a very sustainable way. But we are not aiming to do that everywhere.
Okay, perfect. Anastasio, now to you. You represent the the interest of the carbon capture and utilization industry. And I was curious to hear whether you agree with Anders on some of the challenges that he spelled out, notably funding, the difficulty to find a market, and so on.
Yeah, hello to all. Exactly, I'm bringing the third pillar in the discussion. So we are talking about removals, we're talking about storage, and I'm bringing the utilization element in the discussion. And actually, I agree with all speakers before me. The first step is always reducing the emissions. Reduce the emissions as much as we can, and that will happen whether if we can, first of all, reuse whatever we can reuse, store whatever we cannot reuse, and then we go beyond the net zero with the removals. And CCU is basically about that, is about bringing back the carbon into the production systems. We will still need carbon for many industrial applications, for many transport applications. We cannot simply talk about decarbonization in everything. We need to start talking about defossilization. And there are some sectors that don't have alternatives. So we will be able to reuse the carbon, and instead of having them as an emission, valorize them, bring them back into the production system. And that is important to do as much as we can and create a circular carbon economy so that we can substitute our conventionally produced products with an alternative carbon feedstock. So as much as we can do that, we need to be able to do that. And in that area, we have similar challenges. So in like every clean tech innovative value chain, it will require the support, innovation fund, where CCU is eligible, very important instruments to de-risk also the investment, also from the view of the private funder, that they will see that it is publicly backed in terms of funding, so that they can also come into the project easier. The policy framework that needs to be, especially when we talk about CCU, it's a very complex value chain because it concerns different types of products. It can be on fuels, it can be on chemicals, it can be on construction materials. So it touches upon very many different parts of the policy framework. And this policy framework needs to be consistent and supportive so that it can give the legal certainty to the investors that they can go ahead because their product will be recognized and we can invest in the upscaling. So, and this is the same challenges, but for different business models, for different business value chains that the removals, that the storage, and that the utilization community face when they're looking at bringing those technologies at scales that are industrially relevant.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Christian, maybe back to you. We mentioned a couple of interesting things. I'm thinking now about the voluntary carbon market, which is so closely linked to carbon removals, because it's basically a way to create demand and to make sure we can monetize these carbon removals. And I know you have been trying to, you have been working a lot, especially with the CRCF, with the carbon removal certification framework, to create the architecture for it, the policy architecture. And now there are other interesting policy debates coming up. And one of the main ones is going to be regarding the integration of carbon removals into the ETS. That's already spurring a lot of interest from all of us who follow the carbon market, because obviously the interests are very big. And so I would like to get your thoughts on this, and one particular question about, should we just restrict ourselves, like, let's assume we are gonna integrate carbon removals. This is already a question in itself. But once we do it, should we just restrict ourselves to domestic carbon removals? So I would like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, we are looking into this. Co-legislators want us to look into this until 26, and we are working on this. And for the second question, clearly, we are talking about the European target. So this is about Europe. This is what we do in Europe. It's not about international credits. So if you look at how we've come up with the 90%, it's about what can we achieve within Europe. There are a lot of challenges going forward with removals. I think the first one is we are at the beginning. We are first of a kind projects, really interesting things, but they are more expensive than the current ETS price. So everything we are talking about, when we talk about removals, I think both more in the industrial part of the value chain, but also in the beginning, we are talking about activities that are more expensive than the current price in the emission trading system. So this is the challenge. So we need to find ways, okay, how can we foster that industry? Yeah? It's true also for other mitigation technologies, hydrogen, CCU. So how do we start up all of these industries? How do we become a global leader in these technologies? And that will be the first challenge. So we need a first phase on how can we create, I think you used the word lead markets. How can we create a lead market for that? And then how can we give the long-term price signals in the emission trading system afterwards and beyond? So we need to give credible signals for these investments, so also towards 2050, 2060. So this will be quite a challenge. But I think the first one is still how can we create the first demand? And like one of the smaller initiatives that my team is doing, we will have several events in the first half of 25. How could we, for example, set up a European-wide purchasing program, like a little bit what we have in the US with Frontier? Mm-hmm. So is there an interest from our banks, from our financial institutions, insurances, and so on, some of our bigger companies that have that long-term view, so that we can also from the private side kick off that market. So we are really looking at all possible options. How can we start off that market right now?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Anders, you also mentioned the importance of the voluntary market to have more demand. So what has changed now that at COP29 we saw that we finally agreed on Article 6.4? Has something changed for a company like yours?
I'm not sure, to be honest. The voluntary carbon market and the companies who are working in the voluntary carbon market at the moment, they are are striving towards quite ambitious targets. We can also clearly see if we are talking from a competitive perspective also, which actually will be extremely important for Europe. You can see that the tech industry globally, they see that they will increase their energy demand by tremendously a lot. So they need even more carbon removal credits going forward. So the demand curve is going up. And then call it the supply chain is not taking place. We are a first of a kind mover from our perspective, so we need to deploy projects. I would say that the most important part for Europe at the time being is that we are deploying projects now, that we are supporting many projects so that we see that this is taking off. Because there are definitely a demand out there, and the voluntary market is necessary in order to bring up the volumes. And then we can talk about how that can enter into a compliance market. And I think that should be the next step, of course, but that will take, I would say it will take 10, 15 years, something like that. And then the voluntary car market will play a vital role during that phase. And what happened in Baku, that has happened a lot in Baku, so maybe we need to come back to that, but hopefully that trend is here to stay. Definitely regarding the tech, multi-tech companies globally, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Edvard, you mentioned before also some of the actions that we need to take to make sure we ramp up the carbon removal capacity. If I were to ask you just what should you focus in the next, let's say, 3 years, so short term, short mid-term, especially thinking about the timings of a Commission's mandate, what should we absolutely focus right now?
The biggest thing right now is addressing the cross-chain risk. So people say, what's the cross-chain risk? Well, the cross-chain risk is if I capture my CO2 and Anders takes it and he's going to store it and Christian's going to store the CO2. The problem with that is, and you see this now with these projects, is that one of us is probably going to be finished before the other one. So Christian might be done his storage site, and he's sitting there saying, right, my storage site is open for business, where's my CO2? Meanwhile, the bank is calling Christian and saying, hey, we need you to start prepaying that loan. Anders is building a ship, or maybe he's building a pipeline. He needs a CO2 to be delivered, and I'm also building my capture plant, my cement plant. There's going to be problems in the beginning. Yeah, these things are the first of a kind, so it's the first time someone has ever done that. It's great that Europe is trying this out. But the problem is that there's going to be delayed startup dates, and it's going to be mixed, it's going to be messy, and it's also going to be messy when things start operating. And the problem with that is that, so in the UK, they've done it one way, which is just sort of have 600 civil servants deployed and sort of go through all the details in this. But there probably are other alternatives that can be done there too. We could look at some form of an insurance mechanism that could be developed with the Innovation Fund. There could be some form of a guarantee that member states could do to just underwrite some risks potentially. That involves bringing in the insurance sector. That involves bringing in the banks. I just want to make also one point, because I heard a lot about financing this morning, right? And some people are going to kill me for saying this, but financing is ultimately not so complicated. Ultimately, it's the bank is going to give you a loan, and they want you to pay it back with a little bit of interest on top. What they really want is a stable revenue that comes in. That means that also the people that you're depending on to give you that money, that they can rely on too. The problem with the way in which everything is financed at the moment in CCS and also potentially in some CCU applications and as well as removals in the ETS is that there is no additional revenue that comes from that. All of it is sort of inhibited costs. Lead markets is one key way where Europe can actually put its money where its mouth is in terms of we want low carbon cement, we want low carbon fertilizer, let's pay a premium for it. And then also looking at an additional revenue source that means that these projects can actually take FID, because right now they're struggling because of that.
Okay. I'm afraid we don't have time. I'm really sorry. I think it was an incredibly interesting panel, unfortunately very short, so I need to wrap up. But I would ask the audience to join me in applauding for the panelists. Perfect. And so also the attendees can remain seated because there will be a branded segment just now with Kara Hursta. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Amazon. And after her, there will be my colleague, Senior Climate Reporter Sia Weise, coming back to moderate a panel named Raindrop in the Drought, Building a Water-Secure Future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.